Hello and welcome to another episode of World Cup Rewind. This time we're looking at the 1999 World Cup. So after taking a full circle of the planet Earth, the World Cup returns to where it all started. You saw the first three editions in 75, 79, 83 in England. After that it went to the Indian subcontinent via Australia. After 16 years, it comes back to England, and after the ball getting a lot of hammering in India in that tournament that happened across India, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, where you had pinch hitters, they became very fashionable, in vogue at the time. Now was the time to bring some balance back into the game. So the bowlers were craving to be playing in conditions like in England. For once, now you had green pitches. In fact, green pitches were a thing in those days. It's no more a thing in England now where you get flat batting tracks. So green pitches, lots of rain around, reserve days, and that balance restored.
You know, Nikhil, 1999 was the last World Cup of the century. And it had come back to England where it all started. And you're absolutely right. In India, when you score 300, you're never safe in a 50-over game. In England, if you score 250, you have a competitive chance depending on conditions. England is the one place in the world, and we saw it in the Ashes series with Australia also recently. It's not just what you see on the ground, the pitch, it's also what's happening in the sky. Cloudy skies can transform a game, and those who are seen as medium pacers who you can cart around in Indian conditions, go to England and it's a new game. So this was a more competitive World Cup in that sense, because almost every team had a couple of very good seamers. And if you look across this World Cup, barring of course the great Shane Warne, most of the big wicket takers in English conditions were always the medium pacers.
It's funny I say that the balance was restored, because we will be talking about two real high-scoring encounters, both coming courtesy some Indian batters. But let's now turn our attention to India's campaign. It wasn't a great World Cup for India. It started off when you lost to South Africa. That was a close game that was played in Hove. After that, and I think that was the big jolt that India got, was that loss that they had versus Zimbabwe. 253, India is set to chase down, and you think at one point India are cruising. It all boils down to 9 runs needed of the last 2 overs. India have 3 wickets in hand, and the Zimbabwean captain throws the ball to someone called Henry Olongo, and then, it was harakiri as far as Indian batting is concerned.
Henry Olonga is an interesting character because if you heard him speak, he was straight out of an Oxford or a Cambridge university, spoke in clipped English accent, and later on actually chose to move to England from Zimbabwe. These were difficult times for Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. They got worse in the years ahead. But to lose to Zimbabwe in a World Cup really reflects just how bad a campaign India was having. It wasn't a one-off. This was a struggling Indian team. And interestingly, Nikhil, I think it was a team coming to the end of an era, the Azharuddin era. He was the one Indian captain who captained India in 3 World Cups. And no other Indian captain has captained India in 3 World Cups. Even the great Mahendra Singh Dhoni captained India in 2 World Cups, 2011 and 15. So the Azharuddin era, and the people whose careers had been built around him, their careers were coming to an end. But interestingly, a new emerging Indian batting order was about to sort of flourish in the years ahead. And 1999 did provide us from time to time with a glimpse of that.
Right, but in those days, the Indian tail never really wagged, and that's what happened in that Zimbabwe game. 9 needed of the last 2 overs, 3 wickets in hand, and in the penultimate over, Henry Olongo goes on to pick those 3 wickets. He gets Robin Singh out first, followed by Javagal Srinath, and the last wicket to fall is that of Venkatesh Prasad. So India lose those 3 wickets in the next 5 runs and go on to lose that game by 3 runs. Now that's a big loss. What happened before that game? And I think
just a small word on that game. India gave 51 extras in that game. 51. Please think about the number. A team, no balls and wides. 51.
Yep.
I mean, including, of course, you add your leg buys and buys, but 51 included a number of no balls and wides. So this was an Indian team that lacked the discipline that you so desperately need in England. Out of that 250 odd that Zimbabwe scored, 20% were wides and no balls. Unthinkable in today's India.
One thing that didn't really happen for India in that game, they missed Sachin Tendulkar. Unfortunate tragedy that happened on the eve of this Zimbabwe game. He gets to know that his father is no more, has to fly back to India. I mean, that was really that time that, you know, Sachin Tendulkar, we saw him emotional, comes back, plays that game versus Kenya, where India go on to score 300 plus. He gets 100, but you could see an emotional Sachin Tendulkar on the field.
You know, the relationship between Sachin Tendulkar and his father is one of the more fascinating relationships. Sachin Tendulkar's father was a professor of Marathi, and he himself was a fan of cricket or enjoyed cricket like most Maharashtrian middle-class families do, but he was not a cricketer himself. His mother, on the other hand, as I found out later, was actually someone who would go to Talwalkar Gymnasium in those days, in the 60s and 70s, and trained herself. So I often sort of ripped Sachin that he had got his power, in a way, from his mother, but he had got something that his father had. Anyone who met Ramesh Tendulkar said he was one of the calmest individuals you could ever get. There would be noise all around him, possibly kids in the playground in front of their house, but Mr. Ramesh Tendulkar was always very calm. Sachin inherited, I think, his character of his feet on the ground from his father and the power that he needed to become this top-class batsman from his mother. So I think the father had a huge influence on a young Sachin. He's the one who allowed Sachin, in a way, to explore the world around him from a young age. Didn't put any pressure on him that he had to study, even though he was an academic. And I think that's a fascinating part. So to lose your father in the middle of a World Cup it cannot be easy. And then to fly back, almost all on your own back home, and then come back to play that World Cup and score 100 against Kenya. It was, for Sachin Tendulkar, I think, a moment of grief, but a moment of also showing his courage and his fortitude.
Right. He got a lot of praise for coming back, showing his commitment towards the team, towards the sport that he so loved. He went on to say after that that his father would have wanted him to come and then play that particular tournament for India, and that's exactly what he did. If you go back, look at those visuals, you will see almost tears flowing down his cheeks when he gets to that 100. 140 is what he gets. 329 is what India get versus Kenya, and you think this Indian juggernaut is going to get plenty of more runs, and that's exactly what happens, because then you get the world record. You know, before this World Cup, a 300 had never been scored in a white ball game, in a 50-over game in England, and then you have India do that against Kenya. As I said, better things were to follow. Then you get 373, that game that was played in Taunton. Most Indian fans would remember 373 that India gets. There's a record partnership, 318 if I'm not mistaken, between Rahul Dravid as well as Sourav Ganguly.
You know, as I said, Nikhil, a little while ago, this was the end of the Azharuddin era, but also the start of India's batting dominance. If you look at Indian cricket between 1999 over the next 10 years, we have this constellation of batting stars of the kind I don't think we've ever seen. Sourav Ganguly, who scores 100 in that match against Sri Lanka, in partnership with Rahul Dravid, who also scores a big 100. So you've got the start of the Ganguly-Dravid era, both batsmen who enjoyed remarkable success in England from the very time they started in their opening test at Lord's together.
Yes.
You have, of course, Sachin reaching slowly towards the pinnacle of his batsmanship. He's 29. This is the age where batsmen are reaching another level. And you have the hope that a new generation will join them soon, which is, of course, Lakshman and Sehwag, who joined them later. But the 1999 World Cup exposes us to the possibility that we are no longer just dependent on Sachin Tendulkar. We have in Ganguly and Dravid, both of whom have great World Cups, new heroes in terms of their one-day skills. And both were terrific one-day players. Just another point, when you mentioned the Kenya game, Tendulkar scores that 100, he looks to the skies.
Yes.
He sees perhaps Ramesh Tendulkar smiling at him and telling him, you know, this is what I always wanted. Uh, and watching that, your hair really stands still because, it is emotional. When Sachin scores 100, you sort of cheer with him. When Sachin scored 100 in that World Cup, you almost cried with him.
Well, that's true. And then the Indian juggernaut was indeed, rolling on from there. And that one thing that India started in 1996, that is to have a stranglehold over the Pakistan team, to have a wood over the Pakistan team. It started in that quarter-final in Bangalore that we spoke about in our previous episode. That continued in this 1999 World Cup. Yes, Pakistan did go on to reach the final, but once again, as it happened in 1992, where then Pakistan are defeated to India, but win the title here, they go to the final, but lose to India in that crucial game. In that, it is the Indian team which is dominated by those fast bowlers. Fifer for Venkatesh Prasad. There are 3 wickets for Javagal Srinath. Anil Kumble picks up 227 is what India get. Not a big total. 60 odd for Rahul Dravid. I think 50 odd for Mohammad Azharuddin. From there on, you think Pakistan could chase that. But they go on to lose this game by 47 runs, 180 all out. This was a famed Pakistan batting lineup too. You had Saeed Anwar, you had Shahid Afridi, you had Ijaz Ahmed, Salim Malik, Inzamamul Haq thrown in there. So, stalwarts, but 180 all out.
I remember asking Wasim Akram this when we were doing a TV show with him. What is it about India, Pakistan and World Cups? And he said, I have no answer. I said, is it pressure? He said, no, it's not pressure. It's just that psychologically, when one team has won a series of matches in a particular tournament, they go into the match with a greater sense of confidence because they've done it previously. And he likened it to Sharjah. Sharjah, from the moment that Javed Miandad hit that last ball 6 of Chetan Sharma, for the next 5 years dominated India in Sharjah. But the moment they came to a World Cup, it almost seemed just the other way around. This was a new generation of Indian players. Many of them had not played, let's say, in 1992. But they stepped onto that field against Pakistan, feeling that they could beat the Pakistanis. And the Pakistanis somehow actually seemed to go into their shell, strangely enough, when they played a World Cup against India. Any other tournament, they were as good as us and would often beat us. But in a World Cup, something went wrong with the Pakistanis. And that crowd, and the crowd was evenly divided. England is, in that sense, the perfect place for India and Pakistan to play.
And Manchester in particular.
And Manchester. You've got one side, you've got Pakistanis, and one side you've got Indians. It is not a hostile crowd in that sense, but an evenly matched crowd. And it was great to see India, after losing to Zimbabwe, at least beat the Pakistanis.
Okay, but from there on, India failed to then make it to the semi-final. That was also down to the format, something that we'll discuss as we go along in this episode. But what India will remember of that World Cup was the highest score, individual score, 183 to Saurav Ganguly in that game that he played, we spoke about, versus Sri Lanka. 400 plus runs that Rahul Dravid got was most by any batter in that particular World Cup. So those were personal milestones that India achieved, not making it to the semi-finals as a team.
One other player who did reasonably well in that World Cup was Ajay Jadeja.
Yes.
Was an excellent white ball player, excellent limited overs player. Unfortunately, eventually got tangled, was accused in the match fixing controversy that takes place just a few months down the line and transforms Indian cricket forever. Mohammad Azharuddin, 99 test matches, doesn't get to play his 100th test. But Jadeja had a very special tournament there. They all, of course, got cleared later. But that was a difficult, it was the last stop, as I said, leading into a very difficult time that was to come for Indian cricket. So 1999, in more ways than one, marked the end of a particular era of Indian cricket. An era also, remember, Nikhil, where we were seen as tigers at home and lambs abroad. Yeah. This was the same Indian team that seemed to do so much better at home than they did abroad. And that tournament in England reflected that. We were not up to it. Even though we had some very good players, we were just not up to winning a tournament at that moment in overseas conditions.
Right, so India knocked out of the last 4 in this particular tournament. Interestingly, there were 2 groups in this World Cup, and you had teams that made it to the semi-final. 3 out of the 4 teams came actually from one group. That was also down to the format. We'll talk about that. India out doesn't mean excitement was over, because there were going to be 2 humdingers of games. One of them was South Africa versus Australia, and then there was going to be episode number 2, also featuring the same teams, that is South Africa and Australia. We're going to talk about that next up. Before we take a look at those 2 very exciting encounters between the same opposition, that is South Africa and Australia, one of them is played in the Super 6 stage, I probably need to tell you a little bit about the format of this tournament. It came for a lot of criticism. There were 12 teams divided into 2 groups, and initially, whichever team that you played in your own group, you carried forward the points of the team that had qualified for the Super 6. So from each group that you had 6 teams in one group, you had 3 teams go into the next round. 3 from each group, that made it 6. But you carried forward the points only of the victories that you had against a team that has also qualified. Based on that, it became very interesting. That is why India does not make it to the semi-final. Now, Australia, in their final Super 6 game, are behind Zimbabwe. They need to finish in top 4 to qualify for the semi-final. For that, they need to beat South Africa in their final Super 6 game. South Africa win the toss. Hansie Cronje, the captain at that time, their team puts together 271 runs. This game is being played at Leeds, a place where it really helps fast bowling. 271 when South Africa get, you think it's pretty much done. Australia will not make it to the semi-final. Australia, to make it worse, is 48 for 3, and then there is a bit of a partnership between Steve Waugh and Ricky Ponting. Then comes the 31st over, Lance Klusener, who we're going to talk about a little bit more, because this was Lance Klusener's tournament. He bowls a delivery to Steve Waugh. He tries to flick it towards mid-wicket, but then it hits his bat, hits his pad, balloons up. It's the easiest of the catches for any fielder, not someone like Gibbs who could take the most toughest catches on the field. This easy catch he tries to take, almost takes the catch, but when he's trying to celebrate, that ball falls out of his hand, and the rest, as they say, is history. What do you remember of that game?
The fact is, in cricket folklore, Steve Waugh reportedly said, you've just dropped the World Cup. Now, I asked Mr. Waugh this, again in a show we did with him. He wasn't confirming it. There is no evidence of him saying you've just dropped the World Cup. And knowing Steve Waugh, he's not the kind, in that kind of a battle, to get into a spat with the rivals. He was very much in his zone. He might stare at you, he might mutter, but I don't think he's going to tell Herschel Gibbs, you've just dropped the World Cup, because it was the start of Waugh's inning. It wasn't that he was 100 not out or something and, overflowing with confidence, but look, that's, those are the fine margins of sport. Had Herschel Gibbs caught Steve Waugh, the Australians would have probably gone home. Yes. And who knows, the South Africans could have won the World Cup, something that has eluded them till date. And that was a very good South African side. The 2 best sides of that tournament were Australia and South Africa, no doubt about that. They had the best pace attack, which makes a huge difference in England. And South Africa had some terrific batsmen, including the likes of Herschel Gibbs, Gary Kirsten, Jacques Kallis, Cronje himself. It was to prove also for South Africa in that sense, Nikhil, the end of an era. Because Hansie Cronje was seen as their great hope. Within a year of that, he and many others in the South African team were facing and actually were proved guilty for match fixing.
Okay, at that stage, as I said, 48 for 3 at one stage. When Steve Waugh's catch is dropped by Herschel Gibbs, they still needed 120 more runs. As it turned out, it was Steve Waugh who was 120 not out at the end of that game. Ensures that Australia win that game. They go above Zimbabwe, qualify for the semi-final. And on our next segment, we're going to talk about that, because this was just part 1 of this clash between South Africa and Australia. There was going to be another interesting clash coming up. That was going to be in the semi-finals. In the first semi-final, Pakistan had it very easy, beat New Zealand by 9 wickets. They reached the final. It's the second semi-final where we're going to be looking at, because this is one for the ages. 214 runs is what South Africa were chasing. And I think they were cruising. You had Jacques Kallis who got 53. You had 40 odd by Jonty Rhodes, and you thought that 214, not a big total, they'll reach there. And so it happened. Lance Klusener also, 31 odd of 14 deliveries, takes South Africa just needing 9 runs at the end. This is 9 needed of the final over. Lance Klusener on strike in the middle because Shane Warne had picked up 4 wickets. So there was a bit of a hiccup for South Africa, but Lance Klusener then ensured that, no, I take them closer to victory. So he's on 31 of 14 deliveries. The final over is going to be bowled. The first ball that is bowled, that's hit for a 4 through mid-wicket. Lance Klusener absolutely creams that. Now, the next ball is bowled. That also goes for a 4. It goes to the long off where Mark Waugh is standing. I think it beats him. He can't even move an inch. That's how much power Lance Klusener has in that shot. Now, all you need is 1 run, 4 deliveries left. But the catch is South Africa have only 1 wicket in hand. Klusener on strike, Alan Donald on the non-strikers end. I'm going to get to what happened in that third ball. But before that, just let's take a look at those 2 fours. You think South Africa are cruising. The next ball is a miss hit, actually. The third delivery is a miss hit. He tries to pull it. And then, on that occasion, Alan Donald tries to run. Darren Lehman has an amazing chance to run him out, but misses it. Alan Donald then realizes, oh, I just made a mistake. I could have just lost this game for my team. So now, to the 4th delivery. Rajdeep, what do you remember of that 4th delivery?
What I remember of that match is simply this. I had tickets for the World Cup final, and I was flying out on the very night that South Africa was playing Australia. I reached the airport, and just a couple of overs are left, and Klusener is taking South Africa to victory. And I'm mentally prepared for a South Africa-Pakistan final, which perhaps was not what I was looking forward to when I had got a ticket to the final. I had been hoping Australia versus India, as we always hope a final will be. So you're watching, sitting on this, at the airport lounge. Klusener is in the zone. And I think somewhere what happens sometimes is pressure. You can be the greatest cricketer in the world, and Alan Donald was one of the greats of South African cricket. Klusener was having the tournament of his life. Hits the ball to mid-off.
Yes.
And takes off in the belief that he's taking South Africa to victory. Donald, simply because of what's happened in the ball previously, doesn't want to leave his crease. He is also, remember, number 11. So number 11 batsman, you will often see run-out mix-ups. The Australians sensed their opportunity. They brought the field in, and lo and behold, Klusener and Donald are on the same end. And that one moment of madness, and it can only be called that, moment of madness, moment of extreme pressure, run out. And the Australians, I think, realized that they'd won because they start picking up the stumps, and they seem to believe they won. The South Africans, on the other hand, don't know what's hit them.
Yes.
This is the same team which in 1992 loses a World Cup semi-final to England, when because of the rain rules, suddenly their equation goes out of control. This is the same team which in 96 in India played some great cricket but still loses out. In 1999, I mean, think about it, Klusener and Donald. I think Lance Klusener has to take even more responsibility than Donald. Because you're the guy who's striking virtually every ball for 4. Why do you need to take a single at all, a risky single?
Well, that is something that a lot of people have spoken about, because there were still 2 deliveries to go, and the form that Lance Klusener was in, he could have very well hit a boundary in those remaining 2 deliveries. What Australia, though, had done is, and they had no option, was to bring the field in. That's why that third delivery, Alan Donald tries to run. This time, Klusener is waiting. Probably a bit of conversation between the 2 would have helped, because this time it is Lance Klusener who's a bit anxious, tries to run. Initially, if you take a look at it, Mark Waugh at mid-off misses the stump at the non-striker. But then it's collected, and then it is thrown to the keeper, and in that mix-up, then this run out does happen. Lance Klusener then many times has said probably he should have been a bit more patient. He should have just remained on the crease, but that is something, where you're looking back. For him though, this tournament was a tournament to remember. He got, 200 plus runs in this tournament. In fact, many thought that because he was batting so aggressively, if you ask anyone today, what would his strike rate be? Most people might say, must have been 200, but it wasn't. His strike rate actually in the tournament, and I looked it up, was around 120. But 120 in those days was absolutely outstanding. So he got 200 plus runs at a strike rate of 120, was declared the player of the tournament, and this was the only time in a World Cup where a member of a team that hadn't gone on to win the World Cup was given this player of the tournament. The only other time this happened was Martin Crowe in 1992, and this is the second time this happened. But it was a great tournament for Lance Klusener. Unfortunately, this was the game, this was the tournament where that word stuck on with the South African team, chokers, and it just did not leave them from here on. The final then was expected to be between two teams that were the standout performers in this tournament. It was Pakistan on one side with a very well balanced team, and then this Australian team, which was going to go on to rule world cricket for a very long time. But the final didn't quite turn out the way everyone expected it to be. That's what we're going to talk about up next. Now, Rajdeep and I are standing at the Lord's Cricket Ground, the mecca of cricket. This is a ground which has seen many a historic battles take place, many a memorable games. This was the final of the World Cup, but probably the most one-sided final that we've seen in any World Cup. I'm also taking into account that India-Australia World Cup final that happened in 2003, because this one, when Pakistan comes out to bat, you expect a decent total to be put on board so that you can have a competitive game. Yes, minds will go back to 1983 when 183 proved to be enough for the Indian team to win that. But 133, what Pakistan got, was never going to be enough. And the standout performer there, yes, you had Glenn McGrath pick up a wicket. You had, the other Australian bowlers pick up a wicket. But the standout performer, of course, was Shane Warne. Picked up 4 wickets in that semi-final against South Africa. Once again in his 9 overs, 4 wickets for 33. One of the finest spells that we've seen in a World Cup final.
I've been privileged to see 6 World Cup finals live on the ground. This was arguably the worst. Unarguably the worst, actually, because, you travel to England, you're hoping to see a classic match between 2 fine sides, and one side just goes into deep freeze on the big day. The Pakistanis just somehow were not ready for the occasion. They were lucky to get there. They'd lost to India among other teams. They had sort of made a last-ditch effort to reach the finals, as they often do, as they did in '92, but this was a bridge too far. And the Australians were an interesting side, Nikhil, because leading up to the tournament, Steve Waugh and Shane Warne were apparently no longer on talking terms. Shane Warne had been dropped in the West Indies. His shoulder had begun to show signs of wear and tear, and he held Steve Waugh till the last day of his life responsible in a way for his being dropped from an Australian team. This was in the West Indies. But somehow the Australians have this great ability to rise to the occasion, and that's exactly what they did. Just as an Indian era was ending, the Azhar era, the Waugh era was beginning in Australian cricket. The Mark Taylors and the more standard test players had given way to some quality ODI players. This was the beginning of Australia's dominance. And I got to see someone who was going to become a great for all time for the first time at a match, someone called Adam Gilchrist. Gilchrist was a special cricketer. And you could see it in that World Cup final that, he had the ability to just destroy an attack. You don't have much to chase, but the Australians made that match look ridiculously easy. The Gilchrist, the Pontings, Darren Lehman, I remember scoring the winning run. And it was so strange that as part of the package that we'd gone for the match, we were also assured lunch. And one of the things we got worried about is when the Pakistanis started sort of losing wickets, what happens to our lunch? As it turned out, we ended up spending more time in that lunchroom than we did going back to watch the Australians, because the game was over by 3 p.m.
Yes.
It was the most one-sided final in the history of World Cup finals, and therefore very, very disappointing. But good luck to the Australians, because it started a run by which they won 3 World Cups in a row. Quite incredible what they achieved in that decade that was to follow.
All right. Rajdeep talks about how it was such a one-sided final. 133, Australia chased it down in 20.1 over. The only standout thing you remember, as I mentioned earlier, is the spell by Shane Warne. I could still even remember the wickets that he took. He took Ijaz, and all of them big wickets. He took Ijaz, he got Moeen, the wicketkeeper, Moeen Khan. He got the biggest wicket, that of Shahid Afridi, which proved to be very important. And then Wasim Akram. Those are the 4 wickets that he picked up.
What I remember is a great catch that Ponting takes.
Yes.
I think he's at point, the ball is ballooning, but he dives forward and takes it. And I distinctly remember asking an Australian friend, about how, look at that terrific catch that Ponting's taken. And he turns around to me and says, that's regulation. The Australians, particularly of that generation, and possibly any generation, always took fielding seriously, long before the rest of the world did. And that gave them a cutting edge. I think particularly when you were playing Pakistan or India in those days, where we had at least 5 or 6 players each in each of these teams that you had to hide somewhere in the field. The Australians were super fit, and it was a joy watching them play. Disappointing because the game was over in 3 hours. I'd been to the previous Lord's final in '83, and that was the magical final, India versus West Indies. Then you come 16 years later, and Australia versus Pakistan was just not the kind of match you want to travel 9 hours by plane to watch.
Now, it was a great turnaround by the Australian team. They, in fact, had lost to Pakistan in the group stages. They'd also lost to New Zealand, but turned around their campaign from there. And that one match that they beat South Africa to qualify for the semi-final, that's actually what really set them on the path of winning what happened to be their 2nd World Cup. Remember, we spoke about them winning their 1st World Cup in '87. Now they'd only become the 2nd team after West Indies to win more than a World Cup. An Australian team was to go on to dominate, as Rajdeep mentioned, dominate world cricket for more than 2 decades. The next World Cup, the next episode that when we see you, is also going to be a lot about that dominating Australian team, which now Steve Waugh had gone, but had now been looked after by someone called Ricky Ponting.
That's right. But when we turn to our next episode, you'll also find a transformed Indian side.
All right. So India-Australia final, you know which World Cup we're going to be talking about next. That's going to be the 2003 episode. But for the moment, from Rajdeep and I, thank you so much for watching another episode of World Cup Rewind.
Stay well.